everyone, welcome back. We're here to do another episode of Revisiting the Road to Serfdom. Thanks for being here. Kevin and I are this week, we're going over Chapter 9, Security and Freedom. But for the folks at home who might have missed it, Kevin, why don't you tell people a little bit about what we talked about last time in Chapter 8 to kind of bring them up to speed.
So episode 7, we covered chapter 8, as long as that's not super confusing for everyone. The title of the chapter is Who Whom. So this comes from a phrase popularized by Lenin during the early years of the Soviet Union, answering the universal problem of the socialist society, which is who plans whom, who directs and dominates who assigns to other people their station in life, and who is to have his due allotted by others. These become the central issues to be decided by the central power. So the whom really just comes down to who's controlling your life, right?
Yep.
And this is the central question if you're going to be in a socialist society, but doesn't even really have to be a question asked if you live in a free society, free liberal society. So
yep. It's who plans whom, basically. If exactly. The planners want to create planning, who plans whom, who's being planned, who's having their life planned for them, and who gets to do the planning.
For sure. And I guess real quick, while we go through this, when I say liberal society, I think we have to mention this at the top every single time, liberal in the 19th century European sense, which you are against any coercion by centralized authority. But the liberal that you hear of now in the American sense is almost the exact opposite. It's like, please provide me security, which is what we're going to be talking about today. And I'll trade in my freedom as long as I feel safe.
Yeah, I'm glad you remember to do that. The definitions. Yeah. So liberal, think libertarian, conservative, in maybe our modern parlance, in the parlance of the times, as the dude might say. And same with planning. So planning, think a top-down organized society. Planning is, so if you want to put a face on planning, AOC. AOC is someone who wants a planned society. Green New Deal. We're going to plan the different, like what you can and can't drive and all this other stuff. It's top-down authority, total control of the society, planning everything down, to what job you can have, where you can live, and those kinds of things. So that's planning, just bureaucratic bloat. Anyway, I'm glad you remember that.
I'm also glad that we are like a really professional podcast here, because when you said AOC's face, you didn't say anything about horses or anything like that. That would be an awful, horrible podcast, and we're not about that here. Okay, guys.
Correct. I didn't mention a ghoulish, fake crying out front of, a parking lot at an immigration center.
Yeah,
I didn't
wearing all
mention
white
any
like
of
she's
those
in an
things.
R&B video. That would be awful.
Correct. Yeah, I would never do something like that.
Provide your comments below. Number 2 that went over the last chapter is, up to this point, Hayek talks about democracy, the economy, and the general freedom, but now he actually gets into how society actually breaks down. It was kind of more in the abstract before, what could lead to this possibility. He does, kind of relate it to what happened in Germany leading up to Nazism. But now he kind of shows how it can break down in basically every society. So he says planning doesn't end in the economic sphere or just control how we consume or produce, but it also must control every aspect of our lives, including whether or not we are worthy of contributing to society in any meaningful way. When people say we're just planning the economy, it's a small section of your life. We'll just take care of that stuff. You don't have to worry about clothing or food or shelter. Like, we'll just take care of that. Understand, it doesn't stop in the sphere of the economy. It will bleed into everything else, because economy is really just how we behave with each other. And you have to control the behavior as a whole if you plan on controlling the economy in any way.
It's as possible to compartmentalize that idea as the modern equivalent. We're going to mention, here's your keyword today. Everyone, take a shot whenever you hear this if you want to have fun. COVID. But it's as possible to compartmentalize just the economy, economic life from all the other aspects of life, in the same way that it's like, hey, leave just let the COVID response. It's just let them handle the virology. That's it. It won't impact anything else. Just let Dr. Fauci and whoever else, they'll just handle the virology, and we see where that's led. Where it's all of these other aspects of
life. Our
life.
Politicians say, listen to the science, which now bleeds into politics. And then, like we've talked about in previous chapters, is like, beware when they said we're going to let the experts handle this. It's like, well, no, the experts are not often elected. And they also are very hyper-focused on this one thing, where they will absolutely say, all right, we're going to take out this Delta variant at any cost, whether we had to shut down school, another lost year of education for young children. That's the cost that you pay to make sure that we don't get the sniffles.
And we will put an asterisk here whenever Kevin says another year of education. That is not, we don't want to offend anyone. That's not to actually imply that kids are receiving education in our public education system.
Good.
We just use that as a proxy for the public education system.
Yeah.
So
something
we
that
don't want anyone to get
identifies as education.
right. We don't want to get anyone the misconception that we actually think that the education system provides quality education.
But the last little note on there is a phrase that I think I only uses once, but I think is kind of brilliant, that we forgot what unfreedom means. So we're not scared to give up these freedoms because we're like, well, it's the people who believe that freedom is this default condition, that everyone like understands freedom and wants freedom. While anyone who's read, the Gulag Archipelago understands how people don't automatically believe in freedom. They're totally okay with giving up the freedoms that they think that's what they ought to do, or that's what they're born into. So we're being kind of conditioned in a way that we're starting to understand freedom, at least in a different way, if just not understanding it all, and say freedom's sometimes a bad thing, right? It's the Nazi slogan, free from freedom, that was really, really compelling to the people, right? So because freedom comes with this risk and responsibility that can be really scary. And it's much more comfortable having that security. And the third part, he also covers the bait and switch that we're all too familiar with today between equality and greater equality. This is just more more equal distribution is really what greater equality is. We're trending toward that direction. And as so many socialist linguistic games, this is yet another way of getting people to forfeit their freedoms in exchange for something entirely different than they were promised, really results in everyone is equally poor, equally miserable, and equally homeless now. And, we see that bait and switch there, which today's bait and switch is now equality for equity. And people are not understanding the differences between those two. And those are the subtle linguistic games that will catch us off guard.
100%. Yeah, no, that's a great summary. Chapter 9 is about security and freedom. So as Hayek does such a good job of laying these foundations and comparing, what's that Thomas Sowell, one of the questions he always asks is as opposed to what, is one of the big three he asks. And so Hayek compares tensions between different ideas, I think, really well. And this chapter he gets into the security and freedom and the tensions between those two things. And this was one of the ones, so I think in the introduction, we talked about how Hayek was actually like really well known for taking his criticisms, the criticisms of him very seriously, trying to be really charitable in how he responds to a lot of those criticisms and just trying to take him seriously. And so I think this chapter is one of those places where you can see that he is not obfuscating or punting on any of these criticisms or on any of the problems that socialists are trying to answer. But he's just trying to say, look, your premise isn't necessarily wrong, and we'll get into what he means specifically there, but your answer is wrong, as we see so many times with this type of stuff. But this chapter, he's basically trying to answer give a response to the socialist answer to this question, not the premise. So I'll give you the question basically as framed by this guy, H.J. Lasky, who clearly Hayek does not like. He's quoted him multiple times, a well-known socialist. But so here's a quote by Lasky. It says, "Those who know the normal life of the poor, its haunting sense of impending disaster, its fitful search for beauty, which perpetually eludes, will realize well enough without economic security, liberty is not worth having." And so the point is you'll hear this argument today is that, look, if you don't have any economic security, what kind of freedom or liberty do you really have? And so you'll hear, you've heard AOC say these things. You've heard Bernie Sanders say these things where it's like, okay, but what good is freedom if you're so poor that you can't actually do anything with it? And so Hayek, this chapter is completely dedicated to Hayek saying, look, that is a valid point, that you have to have some answer, some response, some way of dealing with abject poverty, acts of God, like, calamities that no one can foresee or prepare for necessarily. But the socialist answer to these things is not a valid one. It's not a good one, because the socialist might say, or the someone like Lasky might say that if you have no economic security but you have all this freedom, it's like being in jail where you have this free time and you can go roam around the yard, but you just have this little limited space you can move around. So it's like, how free are you actually? And Hayek's point is that if you give away all of your freedom to get some new sense of total security, you end up back where you started, where you have this security, but you're in this little limited space that you can't get out of. So it's the same problem. And his point is, look, these socialists, their answer to things like, calamities, just natural disasters or whatever, unforeseen job loss, will end up in this society that is characterized, and he gives two quotes. One of them is by Nikolai Lenin, the other one's by Leon Trotsky, two famous communist leaders. And the Lenin quote is, the whole of society will have become a single office and a single factory with a quality of work and a quality of pay. And the Trotsky quote, which is the one that's, I think, much better encapsulates the practical realities of what these people like Lasky are advocating for, is, quote, in a country where the sole employer is the state, opposition means death by slow starvation. The old principle, who does not work shall not eat, has been replaced by a new one, who does not obey shall not eat. And so Trotsky wrote that in 1937, and Hayek is saying, look, we're going to get into the practical realities of this problem, but your answer is going to lead to this system, where Trotsky is saying, look, you can have total security where you'll get all the food, you'll be insured food, which even that is a dubious promise at best in a lot of these systems. But we'll make sure you're secure with your food as long as you obey and give in to the planners and the dictates of the planners. So anyway, so that's the fundamental issue that Hayek is trying to address here. And I think he does a really good job of just setting that up in terms of he doesn't ignore the problem, which I think is a testament to his character, really.
Yeah. And I think when we kind of break down Lasky, Lenin, Trotsky, I think their central idea is security is a prerequisite of liberty, where the influence is really in the other direction, that you have to have liberty if you want security. And that's really where they break down. But when you read this quote, it kind of reminds me of the idea taken from the previous chapter when he quotes, who will deny that a world in which the wealthy are powerful is still a better world than the one in which only the already powerful can acquire wealth. What it reminds me here is it kind of changes the dynamic of the wealth dynamic to basic necessities like food, where you can rewrite that previous quote to read, who will deny that in a world in which those who work for it can put food on the table is still a better world than one in which only those who obey the powerful can eat. This is the inevitable future of this when you have all this security but absent of this freedom and liberty. And I think that it always looks like you got to work for your food, but there's some people who can't do it. So, it kind of pulls at your heartstrings. This is probably not an area where we want to go. If people can't work, there's not gonna be able to get food on the table. We want some security for them. But in a world that's the opposite, where everyone gets food supplied for them, well, okay, that supply can easily get cut off arbitrarily. They can pick and choose. And as we'll go through, throughout the chapter, you'll kind of see how the different ways that when they take control of this sector, although it seems like a small sector here, they can really take control of everything and take control of those basic necessities. They're called necessities for a reason, right? They're necessary. So even though it seems small to take care of these small necessities, now they've just gained control of what's necessary for you to live. So it's extremely important to understand that and see that before you give up all of those freedoms. But yeah, so he gets into actually the meat of, at the beginning of the chapter here, quote, when security is understood in too absolute a sense, the general striving for it, far from increasing the chances of freedom, becomes the gravest threat to it. So he puts, he says we must put limits on security provided by centralized power so it does not become a threat to freedom. Hayek is more open to security provided by government than most might give him credit for. And actually, I believe Lasky is one of the people who really, really harshly criticized this book because he claimed no, he's a laissez-faire absolutist. He rejects any sort of security provided by government for people who just have an unfortunate hand dealt to them. No, that's not the case. He does play around with these ideas, and he does go on to, in the next quote we'll go through here, that he does split this idea of security into two different kinds of security. And so it's not just this one uniform idea of all security or no security. There are conditions in between those that may be appropriate for a centralized power to take care of.
Yeah. So I want to just briefly go back to this quote that you read here to at least give people maybe some further explanation of it. When he says, when security is understood in too absolute a sense, the general striving for it being security, far from increasing freedom, becomes the gravest threat to it. So he's saying that if you understand the concept of security in too absolute a sense, like in other words, if you're trying to eliminate all risk from your life, all chance, all anything like that, it doesn't actually increase your freedom. It circles back around and makes it where that striving for total absolute security, total absolute lack of risk or chance, becomes the biggest threat to your freedom. Like think of someone who's like an agoraphobic or germophobic or something like that. Like they're trying to increase their security so much that they end up stuck in their own house, afraid to go outside, afraid to interact with anything, germs or anything like that. I think about that. Do you remember that old Lonely Island song, YOLO, where they like flipped the meaning of it?
Yeah.
So they took the YOLO, you only live once, and put it as like, therefore you need to beware of all threats and danger, and couches are going to, I got one word about furniture, killing machines, and at the end, they're all like in their apartment, like with tinfoil hats on, saving piss and mason jars and stuff, because it's like, I only live once. I got to remove all threats. And so therefore I have no freedom because I've become so beholden to this notion of absolute security. But that's what he's saying there, is that it sounds counterintuitive, but you have to find the right balance. And this is where personal choice comes in, between how much risk you are willing to bear individually. And that has a direct relationship to your own freedom. But we'll get into a quote that literally says this, where it's like, either you have both of those things or you bear none of those things when it comes to both risk and freedom. So, but that's what he's getting into here. So he, like you said, he contrasts two different kinds of security. One of them's limited, one of them's absolute. And the absolute security, that's the one you got to be wary of, although the limited one, like you said, could possibly lead to that. And we'll get to that in a minute. So Hayek says, quote, "It will be well to contrast at the outset the two kinds of security: the limited one, which can be achieved for all, and which is therefore no privilege, but a legitimate object of desire, and absolute security, which in a free society cannot be achieved for all, and which ought not to be given as a privilege, except in a few special instances, such as that of judges, where complete independence is of paramount importance. These two kinds of security are, first, security against severe physical privation, the certainty of a given minimum of sustenance for all, and second, the security of a given standard of life." So I'm going to pause there really fast. So he's saying, look, the first one is like severe privation. Do you have a place to live? Do you have food? And so basic necessities, like you said. The second one, the absolute security, is like, are you guaranteed a certain standard of life, which is a very different thing, very different thing. This is where you get into like arguments for UBI and other idiotic proposals. So he says, or as we may put it briefly, the security of a minimum income, there we go, and the security of a particular income a person is thought to deserve. So this is subjective. We shall see presently that this distinction largely coincides with the distinction between the security which can be provided for all outside of and supplementary to the market system, and the security which can be provided only for some and only by controlling or abolishing the market. So limited security, security against basic life-threatening circumstances, starvation, disease, whatever. Absolute security, guaranteed of a given standard of life. UBI, government-sponsored jobs guarantee. Where have we heard about that? Everything's infrastructure. Is this infrastructure? Is that infrastructure? What isn't infrastructure?
Racism.
I saw a butterfly today. Is this infrastructure? So it's that meme. Is this infrastructure? The butterfly. So anyway, those are the two different things he's talking about here. And I think that, especially at the end there, he does raise an interesting question about limited security, absolute security as two different things. So yeah, I don't know, but go ahead with what your thoughts are on that. But there's an interesting point he brings up here that's probably worth talking about.
Yeah. I mean, you went over it really well. I think, the limited security part is where you take care of the people who, there's some people who just have a rough, hand dealt to them, that they can't take care of a lot of these different things. A lot of more able-bodied people who are what would be considered now privileged, but not privileged in the sense that he uses it here. There's a very important distinction that I think I get to later, but I can say it now, that the privilege that he gets into here is like privilege by arbitrary law or rule that actually gives people, like you think of a white privilege. White privilege was definitely a thing in the Jim Crow South because there were explicit laws, giving a certain group advantages over another group. Where privileges here is just like, okay, I'm privileged enough to grow up with parents who are well off. So now, I have more options available to me. So that's the problem with limited securities. It starts to bleed into, all right, well, what limits do you put on there? Do you put limits on people who are just born with a disease that does not allow them to go in the workforce? Okay, that's a reasonable limit there. But now do you expand the scope of the limits to people who just grew up in a poor household? Okay, well, now we're expanding this. Now you're starting to move from, this protecting against life-threatening circumstances to now guaranteeing a standard of life that you talked about there. And now you branch it out to UBI, government-sponsored job programs, which I think is kind of insane to me, and all these other guarantees that this blanket of security has that's going to add all this noise into a free market that's now you're going to have a public sector really competing with the private sector, and you're going to get all kinds of problems that stem from that. But I think there's a larger question here, when it comes to Hayek giving ground and saying, okay, maybe there is a role for this limited security. The question that I think we would have if he were here, if we were able to interview him, is like, what should any power guarantee any sort of security at all? I mean, Hayek believes so by stating there's no reason, this is a direct quote from the book, there's no reason why in a society which has reached a general level of wealth, which ours has attained, the first kind of security should not be, the first kind being limited security, should not be guaranteed to all without endangering general freedom. So this is kind of a talking point you hear from the left now a little bit too, right? This is how they kind of gain ground into that limited security territory, and then they make ground into toward the absolute security territory, right? You have to guarantee a minimum wage before you jump to UBI. You can't just jump from 0 to 100. It's very difficult to get there, so you got to ramp up in some sort of way. So really the question here is, should any sort of security, limited or absolute, be guaranteed by a centralized authority? Can we get around that? Is there some sort of communal response instead of a government-sponsored response that should be obligated to take care of people who, again, have a bad hand in life, who are not able to do certain things? Or should we allow this limited security to be sponsored by the government?
Yeah, I mean, that's the question, right? And that's the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these rights is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so our founders understood that the role of government is to secure those rights, right? So provide a system where you have the security to pursue those rights and to act within those rights, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, which one could certainly, I think, derive a concept of a standard of living from that. But it seems much more likely to me that the government's response, because that's the ultimate question here. It's not, should there be an entity that helps facilitate these things, but is it the government's job to do it? And Hayek is saying, look, we've reached a certain level of material wealth, and you hear Bernie Sanders say this, call me crazy, but in the wealthiest country in the world, where the top 1% billionaires could thing, I think it's safe to say that everyone should be given a 40-inch flat screen TV, or something ridiculous like that. And so they use those arguments. It's like, because we're so wealthy, people use the, if we can put a man on the moon, we can do X or whatever thing, as if they're one-for-one comparisons. But the point is it's like, sure, we should have entities that can help with this thing, but can the government do that? And the problem is that we see so oftentimes is that there's no logical conclusion, there's no logical endpoint, there's no guardrails to what it looks like, because these are all completely subjective definitions, and it changes. And there is this book, or the two books that really influenced my thinking on welfare programs, nanny state kind of things, are The Tragedy of American Compassion and The High Cost of Good Intentions. And The Tragedy of American Compassion gets into, that's a book that's more like, talks about religious charities and stuff, and how in the 1800s, there used to be these two terms that are kind of unpopular. I've talked about this before, but, well, they'd be unpopular now. Back then they weren't, but it was like the deserving versus undeserving poor. And it was like, okay, there are these churches and like different civic organizations that they weren't government things, that were dedicated to helping people like get back on their feet if something happened. But the deserving poor was like, this bad thing happened. I just want to get back to where I can live my life, and that's are they trying to work? Are they trying to do this other stuff? And those were places where it'd be like soup kitchens where there were requirements of you being there. It's like, they would have like a program where you would work doing these things, or were you looking for a job? And then the government comes along and creates these ones where there's no requirements to get food. It's like, of course, people are going to pick that. And so, yeah, there were, like you said, communal responses to these things. But the other problem in the high cost of good intentions that he lays out is, and this is where my main criticism of like Hayek's point here would stem from, is that you create a circle. And the problem that, I forget what the author's name is of that book, but it's a fantastic book, where it's the no less worthy argument. So anytime you create a system where you have people that are getting a benefit from the government, you just drew a circle, and these are the people receiving it, and then everyone outside the circle are those who are not receiving it, right? But whenever you create a circle, you have people on the fringes of that who are barely not eligible to receive that benefit. And so then these people come along and say, well, they're no less worthy than this. Those who are barely inside the circle and those who are barely outside the circle of receiving these benefits of this, limited security. Who's to say, the distinction is so minuscule here. Why wouldn't we expand it to include them? And ultimately they do. The argument that the author of that book uses originally, he talks about like benefits for soldiers of the Revolutionary War and then the War of 1812. And then the Civil War and how it expanded out and out and out. And he includes the example that I think is incredible, at least when the book was written, which wasn't that long ago, is that there was a person living today, or at least, again, when that book was written, within the last 10 years, who was receiving Civil War pension of Civil War soldier, because it was a Civil War veteran who in the early 20th century had a kid with someone who's really young, and that kid was still alive. And because of the extension of benefits, they were getting, it was like maybe like $56 a month. But the point is that when you create the circle and you include those who are no less worthy, all you did was just create another group who's no less worthy. Right. And so then the cycle repeats until it eventually includes like, things that don't make any sense in there. But that's the natural progression of these things. That's the argument that we've talked about with the conservatism arguing for 0, the progressives arguing for 10, they settle on 5. The next iteration is not 5 to 10, but 5 to 15, settle on 10. So I think it's probably safe to say that, and, I don't know, you tell me what you think here, that Hayek would maybe, if he saw what they've done today in the natural progression of how they've expanded out these standards that are just so vaguely stated and totally subjective that they can just make an argument for them, and get people to agree because they sound nice, that he probably would not, or at least he would have a lot of asterisks on this idea of guaranteeing, at least a government guaranteeing limited security, because of how it expands out and out and out until it's just completely insane. And we're seeing this like with what's the government's trying to guarantee this security now with rent relief and all of these payments and stuff. And it's absolutely destroying the economy. So I think it's good that he's trying to answer the question, and trying to deal with like this. And again, it speaks to his character and his intellectual honesty. But the idea that the government has to be the one to do that, as opposed to, like you said, some kind of communal response or having a family, anything like that, any non-NGO type thing, I think is naive. And honestly, I don't know why he didn't include that. I don't know why he said that the government needs to be the guarantor of it instead of saying we just need a mechanism to do this. I frankly don't know why he did that.
Well, he's going to go into some more tangible stuff here in a little bit, but just to comment on what you said there is this, you're talking about this limited blanket expanding out into the absolute blanket, of security. And I think, when he talks about that there are ways to have a limited security, that must mean there's some sort of limiting principle. And the limiting principle is if it does not infringe on competition, then it's okay. But once it starts infringing, okay, you can't do that anymore. The problem is people will, and as he explains in here, people will abandon that limiting principle and be willing to take the absolute security because it's become part of the culture. He continues on a little bit here that not only, and really what came from the other quote is not only when you start with making policies of security that promote security, you start to get people dependent and, rewire the mind to be like, okay, this limited freedom is okay. I can live with it. I can survive with it. Let's continue apace here and try to build prosperity through security. And by that time, it's already gonna be too late. So limiting principle is going to fail. But he does get into some stuff here that is much more, like I said, tangible and that I think is going to kind of broaden our disagreement with him. But I do think that there's a difference if he had wrote the book today compared to writing it in 1944, to give him some sort of leeway there. But so he goes on talking about the combating what he calls general fluctuations in the market. He gives an example of large scale unemployment and how there might be a place for government solutions that are not incompatible with 19th century liberalism, like I explained before. Examples he gives are changes to monetary policy and temporary increase in public works projects. We've seen increase in public works projects before. What was it, infrastructure that will boost the public works projects. I also think FDR, New Deal.
He knew about that too. Yeah. He knew about the Tennessee, Tennessee River Valley Authority or whatever. And so he knew about those things. He knew what abject failures they were. So it's weird he even brings these things up without criticizing them further. I don't know. Sorry to interrupt.
I understand his monetary policy because he lived in a time that we weren't so interconnected with different currencies and stuff like that. So I understand that, but yeah, public works is like, man, you got to you've lived through what happens when you expand those too much. And only if you know now how much of a saint they've made FDR with the New Deal is pretty insane. But he continues to say, quote, through its solution will acquire much planning in the good sense. It does not, or at least needed not, require the special kind of planning which, according to its advocates, is to replace the market. So Hayek does mention that solutions like the increase in public works, like we said, might increase the volume of government expenditures, but he basically says that we must be careful. And the problem is, I don't think we can ever be careful enough when using public dollars. You use $1 here to pay for some sort of public assistance, like the clamoring again, that limited blanket's going to continue to expand because people on the outside looking in are like, okay, why don't I get that? I'm missing it just by a little bit. So it's naturally going to expand. So I don't know if there's any sort of limiting principle that is going to maintain this small scope of this limited security. But he also mentions a correction through monetary policy. But I think if you're around today, he would reverse track on this idea completely. I think if you were around to see what the Green New Deal proposal is today, or the increased advocacy of modern monetary theory, he might consider rewriting this part of the chapter. But the main point here is he is thinking through these ideas rather than shutting them down completely, which is something that, when you talk about people who don't at least think through these ideas and explain them, that's a lot of modern conservatism is just rejecting it and saying, student debt, yeah, it's a problem. Let's just cut it off here. And people who are in debt, they just got to pay for it, right? That's not always a great response if you don't actually flush out the idea a little bit more. And that's something that at least Hayek, I think, would write a chapter on what to do on that. But I do think he would reverse track on a lot of this stuff and be like, okay, monetary policy, that's not a great thing to dabble with, because that's really what's been screwing us, I think, a little bit more than anything else. To think that after the New Deal, that the Green New Deal will be proposed and actually advocated for publicly, that's pretty crazy. So I would really be interested to see how he would, because I guarantee you he'd rewrite the beginning of this chapter, at least, if you're around today.
Oh, totally. I think so too. As an aside, I wonder how difficult it would be, because we've had that same thought 100 times, right? What if Hayek was here today, X, what would he say about this? I wonder how hard it'd be to get a hold of the guy who wrote the preface and assembled all this stuff to try and to get his thoughts on it. That's an aside, but it might be worth looking into.
Bruce Caldwell.
So Hayek, he addresses this, right? So he addresses the tension. That's what he's doing in this chapter. And so this first part here is where he's saying he's respecting the question. He's respecting the question of what do we do about these things? And now is where he moves into kind of the consequences of where he talks about that pursuit of absolute security can become the greatest threat to your freedom. And so now he gets into what happens when security, because the distinction he makes in the definition between limited and absolute is in the limited sense, he's saying that's not a privilege. If it's something you work for and earn, that's not some privilege conferred. It's just what you got from your work. Whereas in the absolute sense, it is a privilege conferred, and it can only be conferred to a limited group of people. And so he gets into what he means by that. He says, no wonder that in consequence, the value attached to the privilege of security constantly increases. And so he's talking about this sentence picks up after a thought. So I'm going to tell you guys what the thought was. But he's saying, in a system where absolute security is a privilege conferred. So he's saying, in that type of system, in what people like Lasky is advocating for, or AOC or Bernie would be advocating for today, that the privilege of security constantly increases, the demand for it becomes more urgent until, in the end, there's no price, not even that of liberty, appears too high. So he's saying, once you're pursuing absolute security at all costs, and you're seeing, like you said, people on the outside going, well, I want that. I'm left out. I'm out in the cold. I want that, and it becomes a thing that people are trying to fight over because they realize only a few people can get it. That's what we talked about at the end of the last chapter, the breakdown of society. Once people understand, oh, if we're going to planning, someone's having their life planned and someone gets to do the planning. There's a scramble to be one of the planners. It's the same thing here. There's a scramble to do whatever you got to do to get that privilege of security, even at the cost of liberty. And, I think, again, here's that, take a shot, but the COVID here, we've seen that the population, whenever there's some sense of urgency, some sense of a new threat or that's manufactured, I think largely, at least for most of the population, obviously not saying COVID isn't a thing that can kill people. It has killed a lot of people, but the threat to the total population is small on average. But you're seeing people saying exactly what he says here, that there is until the end, no price, not even that of liberty, appears too high if the demand for security becomes more and more urgent. So what's the news? Delta space AIDS is going to kill us. And so this new demand for security is so high. People are like, take my liberty, take my freedom, to try and get me some kind of sense of security. But even this is one of those things where it's like, and I think Hayek talks about this. I can't remember which chapter it was. You can remind me here, but about in the wartime where there is a planned economy, people do give up some of those liberties, but they actually get, what you might call a good ROI on that investment. They get a good return on investment on what they're doing there by giving they're getting in line with the planned thing during war. It's like, okay, yeah, we got to make tanks. Okay, we need to make tanks.
That was like the first 1 or 2 chapters he talks about that, but also in the introduction, he talks about that because after a re-release later on, he actually got to see oh, I kind of predicted this right. We had a wartime economy. It kind of boosted the economy. And then they're like, all right, let's use this temporary wartime economy as our permanent economy moving forward. And he's like, well, that's an awful idea because that, again, is strictly a planned economy in a sense that at the time it's useful. It's useful to have a wartime planned economy if you're in war. For a very, very short temper. But again, we're talking about temporary that gets spaced out to absolute at some point. So beware, even when it makes sense to do it, be cautious.
Yeah. And at least in the wartime, I think the example he gives, like with a general, this may be in chapter 2, where he says there are, like you said, those limiting principles because it's like when the war is over, it's over. And so they actually have, an intelligible yardstick to measure that. But what with the COVID thing we're seeing now is people are saying, take all my liberty. I'm okay with giving up this freedom. And what are they even getting in return for it? It's a freaking placebo, man. In a lot of cases, obviously there are some people where it makes sense, but I would say that's probably less than 5%, 10% of the population. Maybe that's probably an underrepresentation, maybe more. I would need to see what percent of the population is over the age of 70. But even then, it's like, okay, get vaccinated and you're fine. Probably, if you're older, but either way, the ROI on giving up freedom in exchange for security in this situation is very different than like World War II and so on and so forth. But the main point is, I don't want to deviate too much on that because I'm sure we will later go back to it, but is that people, whenever security becomes a thing that's a privilege conferred, people don't want to be outside of it. They want to make sure they get that thing, and they will. And especially if there's a sense of urgency, whether real or perceived, they will get caught up in it. It's like that. If you look at if you study of like mobs and crowds and stuff, where people just get so caught up in the moment that they don't really think about it, and they're no longer acting individually, but they're acting as part of a collective, even mentally. That you see this with this like, take my liberty, shut up and take my money, shut up and take my liberty, so I can have this sense of security. And we're seeing that today. That's my point, is that Hayek understood this part of human nature. Again, these are people, they aren't prophets. They just understood how a thing works when it's allowed to work, how it works. They understood human nature. And we saw it today, where it's like, yeah, people don't fundamentally want freedom. They fundamentally do want to be taken care of. And that's exactly what Hayek is saying right here.
Yeah. And I even think,
go ahead.
Well, I even think when you're talking about the expansion of this limited blanket of security, the people on the outside looking in, the problem with it too is, it's not like the people outside looking in are always people who are, poor and destitute and like really need it. It normally takes care of those people first. And by the time that expands out far enough, you're talking about people who are well off, being like, you talk about COVID, the payments and tax credits for children right now, that they're just paying people who have kids just cause, right? Like, why, if I'm over the limit and I don't get any compensation for my child via tax credit or a direct payment, I think they're direct payments right now. Like, why, just because I make good decisions, I went to school and I'm, well off, like, why do I not deserve to be compensated by the government just because, I have kids and I'm in the same circumstance meaning having kids? It's like, why do so I'm the one paying into it. My taxes are getting taken, redistributed to someone else. And now I don't get any benefit from it, which, is a true privilege over there, but I'm not being privileged at all. So even in the case that you don't absolutely need it, you're still on the outside looking in. That's going to build class resentment right there. If you want to really, really flush that out, something, class resentment has never really been a big thing in America. That's why they always focus on race, because they realize they can't do the same thing in Europe compared to America. But that is a great way to start it up if you really want to do that. And that is what happens when that's the arbitrariness problem inside of security. Like, if you can't picture that easily, picture it there, and that how we've already seen it in the very limited way that security has been applied, but now growing in the past couple of years because of COVID.
Yeah, and I mean, it's the same thing with the student loan stuff, where people were like, what if I made my last payment, paid off my student loans this year, and then they just forgave everyone's debt? Like, like you said, what better way is there to create resentment of people who worked hard and made the right decisions? Anyway, than by having them be left out of those things. So Hayek continues with this quote where he says, if we want to leave them the choice, if they are to be able to judge what they ought to do. And so I'm gonna pause right here, because transitioning from the quote we just read to this quote is not going to make sense probably to people without talking about what he's saying here. Is he's saying, okay, look, he's making another contrast. If you have a system where security is a privilege and it's conferred, you're going to lose your freedom because you're going to just give up anything to get that conferred privilege of security, that absolute security. He's saying, but in a system where people are able to choose, which is different than what he just described, with the absolute security, if you want to leave people a choice of what they should do, what occupation they should pursue, again, we're talking about in a free system, if they're to be able to judge what they ought to do, they must be given some readily intelligible yardstick by which to measure the social importance of the different occupations. So we're talking about if you're free. Even with the best will in the world, it'd be impossible for anyone to intelligently choose between various alternatives if they offered, choose between various alternatives if the advantages they offered him stood in no relation to their usefulness to society. So he's saying, in a free society, you have to have an intelligible yardstick, which is prices, money, those kinds of things, which we'll get into, in order to tell what you should or shouldn't be doing. This goes back into previous chapters where he's talked about whether it's actually the one economic security and totalitarianism, I believe, is what it's called, where he's saying if you don't get to choose your occupation, then you have no way. None of this revolves around contributing positively to society if it's being chosen for you. And so you have to have something in order to choose. But if you're in a system where what the pursuit is like some type of total security, you're answering to someone else, someone is planning your occupation for you, like, you have no way to know of what you're doing is actually useful to society, if it's a value to society, because you're not given a price, you don't know anything about the supply and demand of that thing, because it's just being dictated to you. You're not choosing it in a system where you actually understand where you have clear information coming in to explain what you should or shouldn't be doing. So just as an example, like today, since we live in a free society, I know that I probably, if I was going to pick an occupation, I probably shouldn't make my occupation someone who fixes, well, yeah, unless I live in an Amish community, I probably shouldn't become a carriage, someone who repairs wagon wheels or something like that, or repairs riverboats, riverboat wheels or steam engines or something like that, because I have the information where I can look and see how much do those people make? Like, how in demand is that job? Not really in demand, but in a society where everything is dictated to me, I don't know if what I'm doing is valuable, and therefore my investment in it, just even personally, is going to be very disconnected from it. So yeah, I don't know if that makes sense, Kevin.
No,
I don't know so much think there.
What you got is explained there is the brilliance and the undercover brilliance, I would say, of a price mechanism in a free market system. Is you're compensated based on your value to the market, which is your value to the people spending money on your particular product. So we need to think about this, especially the exchange of capital, in a way that we should see money as a carrier of information. I've listened to someone explain it to me this way before, and I forgot who it is. So, credit to them. List it in the comments if you know who it is. But you see money as a carrier. So it's like a carrier of information, like a cable is between one house to another conveying information. This money should act like that information. And when in a completely free, laissez-faire economy, I know exactly how much my skills and my time is valued at because of the way I'm willing to get compensated. Now, if you add something into that system, the constraints into a free market, you can even take something as simple as minimum wage into that. What you're doing is you're adding noise into the system. So now you're adding noise into this wire that the person, I'm trying to convey information from one house to the other. The person at the other house is now getting my information, but now it's staticky. It's noisy. They cannot grasp every little detail that I'm trying to give to them. You add more barriers into the market like this. You add UBI, you add, government guaranteed jobs. You add all these different things, these different types of security blankets. Now there's a whole bunch of noise in the system, and you can't expect the person in the other house to get any of the information I'm trying to convey to them because it's so noisy, it's so staticky. They don't know like what their actual job is valued at. And they can't make an intelligible choice based on, what the value is of that job to society. So you're completely replacing that, and it needs to be filled by something, right? So the idea here is the planners will now give you that information, but they can kind of manipulate it any way they want to, which will really, there's no way to create more prosperity through that system because they have to build their, social, their kind of hierarchy of ends that they believe is best for society, instead of having us as consumers through the price mechanism get to tell the producers, what we value and what we value most, and what's going to give us more meaning in our lives. Yeah. And then he goes on to talk about like the more serious consequences of a planned economy. So he goes in here, quote, "While the last resort of a competitive economy is the bailiff, the ultimate sanction of a planned economy is the hangman. As neither the risk nor the gain falls on the individual, decisions cannot be left to his personal judgment, but whether he does what he ought to have done according to some established rule which must decide. A mistake he ought to have avoided is not his own affair. It is a crime against the community, which should be treated as such. He may be economically secure so as long as he satisfies his superiors, but his security is bought at the price of the safety of freedom and life." So you're quite literally trading freedom for security, which ultimately just means your choices are not your own. He talks a lot about choice leading up to this chapter and how important choices are, because that is what provides meaning to your life. Now you're in a system where, sure, you get to make choices, but those choices are no longer your own. The consequences for those choices will be dictated by the planners, not by, when you make a mistake here. A good example is when you make a mistake, you may have, a temporary injury to yourself in that mistake, but you can transform that injury into some sort of important life lesson, right? You make a mistake, you learn from it, you move on. But now this mistake, this relatively small mistake, is a crime against community, the nation, and the social body. Your mistakes are no longer your own, which means the planners are obligated to everyone else that they have to plan for to determine your punishment. And that's where this true It's not, I mean, corruption is a word for it, but servitude, that's you're serving the planners in this instance.
Yeah. And I think it's really important, this is, a part that if we had like highlights or clips, I would say this is, a bullet point that people need to understand. In a competitive society, people will still break the law. People might still try to cheat to get ahead. That's what the bailiff represents there in that quote, is the enforcement of law, and common law, English common law, blind justice, as we've referred to before. But in a planned economy, where the risks and the penalties and gains and whatever all doesn't fall on yourself, it falls on the planner. They're going to use the hangman. They're going to use death. I mean, that's the Trotsky quote, right? He who does not eat, or he who does not obey, does not eat. It's death. He says death by starvation, but death. And so that's the differences here in this society, in a planned society. And this one quote, again, get your shot glasses ready, where he says, a mistake he ought to have avoided is not his own affair. It's a crime against the community and must be treated as such. Like, where are we seeing that today with masks and vaccinations, right? If you don't want to wear a mask, or if you don't want to get vaccinated or something like that, that's not a risk for you. That's a crime against the entire community. And credit where credit's due. I understand the argument there of like, you're putting other people at risk, potentially, whatever. But as we get more data and see what's the actual contrast of the risks that you might be putting someone, in, it has been greatly exaggerated and inflated by, in order to uphold the narrative. And so that's where we're getting all these articles about resentment. And if you're not wearing a mask, you must be a bad person. Or if you're not vaccinated, you're an anti-vaxxer, like Dreg, stupid idiot, threats to society.
Trump supporter.
Exactly. Yeah. You're a Trump supporter, terrorist, whatever thing. And so this is where this collectivist ideology kind of hive mind thing, this is what he's talking about here. It's not your personal thing. It's not about your choice, but it's about the whole community. And so you're going to get this response, and you'll be treated as a threat to the community, which again is what we're seeing here today.